Hey, welcome to another Your NHS show here on Socialist Telly. This show, I'm joined by Nico and Dr Youssef el-Gingihy, who is a GP in our wonderful NHS. I wonder if, Youssef, would you like to start off by telling us a bit more about yourself, please?
Well, thanks for having me on, Bonnie. I'm a GP. I've worked best part of a decade in Tower Hamlets, London, but I've moved recently to a very different part of the world. So I'm in North Oxfordshire, which is, I guess, miles physically and otherwise from the East End of London. Although, guess what? The same things are happening in different parts of the country. So we're right next to the Horton Hospital, which is facing, again, closures and cuts and downgrades. And there's a big campaign there to stop that, which I was familiar with beforehand.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important to remember that all of these cuts are not unique to specific hospitals or locations. This is deliberate policy across the whole of England at the moment, because healthcare is broken up to provision by the different nations in the country, which maybe was the first indicator of the smashing of the National Health Service, perhaps. Thanks for that. I hope you're happy in your new home, and obviously we'll support you fully in your endeavours to keep services in your hospital where you are now. Nico, obviously you're a regular on our shows now. You want to tell us a bit more about yourself this time?
Why not? What can I say? I've been in the Labour Party since 2011, around the time of the Health and Social Care Act. When reading about the history of it, the recent history, and with the idea that if the NHS was going to be restored one day in this country, the way it looks is that it was likely to need to be the Labour Party, but it would need to do a complete U-turn on its commitment to putting profit before people, because that didn't happen. It hadn't happened. There'd been a lot of pretense of it from both parties, but not an actual turn. So again, Jeremy's leadership was really the biggest opportunity we've had to do that, and it's changed the way people talk about it. But in policy terms, and in terms of the full narrative about it, calling out the policies we're talking about today, that only happened while Diane Abbott was Shadow Health Secretary, because the other health secretaries were aligned with the previous trajectory that never went away. So that's where we are, I think.
I mean, that's really interesting. Obviously, the NHS is our proudest achievement as socialists in this country. But there has been a history for at least the last 40 years of deliberate attempts to sabotage it, and those attempts are all building up to a plan to take it from us. And it was initially sort of done by stealth, but it's become much faster progress to remove it from us. Yeah. A lot of this is being done so subtly that it's almost easier to ignore that it's taking place. So, Youssef, can you explain to the people watching what exactly has been going on with our NHS?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is, as you've exactly identified, it's a program of marketisation and privatisation. So turning a public universal healthcare system into a market system and gradually privatising more and more of it. And that's being carried out now piecemeal over decades, so going back to the 80s. And it's very interesting because there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation, a lot of PR and spin, particularly in the mainstream media, about NHS policy. And there's therefore the British public's on the receiving end of a lot of this really nonsense and propaganda, whereby very few people who are involved, particularly in the health policy bubble, and those receiving information from them, are understanding the real issues. So we constantly hear about the memes about aging populations, about the NHS as a black hole for funding, all these kind of things, that it's endless red tape and bureaucracy. These are the problems of the NHS, and that's not really the case. The main issue particularly is the cost of running a market system, and all the international evidence points to the fact that the more you turn healthcare into a market and the more you privatize it, the more expensive it becomes, basically, and the more fragmented it becomes. And that if you're going on evidence rather than ideology, the most cost-effective way to run healthcare is basically publicly funded, publicly run, publicly owned healthcare. which is what, of course, the NHS was in its golden age from its inception in 48 till the 70s. It was basically a public system, and it's gradually been converted from the 80s onwards.
That's a really important summary. The fact is, the NHS was the most efficient health service in the world. And I remember growing up thinking it's really bad for those poor Americans who are having to buy additional insurance for their healthcare, and recognizing all the problems they have with different hospitals accepting certain insurance providers and rejecting others, and people having to sort of be driven around by ambulances to get to the right hospital. And yet the cost to the US government is far greater in that scheme, even though they're actually providing very little healthcare for their citizens. It's actually costing them more because of that, and it is also the biggest single cause of bankruptcy in the United States. So the idea that we can have gone from this proud position of having our national health service looks after everybody regardless of their means equally, taken away to move to this far inferior US model, is horrific. So how have they gone about getting us to this position then, Youssef?
Well, this is the thing: is the NHS is such a big system that, you know, it's not Royal Mail, it's not British Gas. You can't just privatize it overnight, sell the shares. It's a much bigger entity to privatize, and also there's much greater support for it. You know, frankly, if Royal Mail's privatized, as detrimental as that is, it doesn't have the kind of resistance that is often the case with the NHS, and because of that, in fact, back in the early 80s, we now know, because 30 years had elapsed, so this was revealed back in about 2012, we know that Thatcher in her first term unveiled plans for full-scale privatization of the NHS, with the kind of sell-off. The plan was to have private ownership of hospitals, laboratories, to have private insurance, etc. And that was met with stiff resistance from the cabinet, who felt that this was political electoral suicide, essentially, and it wasn't politically expedient. So that's very telling. And so the plans were kind of not so much shelved as just adapted. And what you see in the mid to late 80s is the emergence of blueprints from right-wing think tanks such as the Centre for Policy Studies and the Adam Smith Institute, in which they outline and this was particularly came from the one paper for Centre for Policy Studies came from Oliver Letwin and John Redwood, in which was called, trying to remember the name of it now. Nico will remember better than I do. I think it was Britain's Biggest Enterprise, and they outlined a specific methodology, if you like, a sequence of events for how you could gradually convert the NHS from a socialist healthcare system essentially into a free market one, basically, and that vision has actually been remarkably faithfully adhered to. If you look at those steps now, 40 years on or so, it's pretty shocking to see how a cross-party consensus of parties that are all signed up to, all subscribe to free market economics, have actually executed that.
It's a very, very scary roadmap that exists there. So obviously we'd urge anyone watching this to investigate this blueprint by Oliver Letwin and John Redwood further. We're quite a long way down the path now, but what, as a person interested in politics, I think it's important to point out that this plan was designed by Conservatives, and we've had several governments since Margaret Thatcher's government have pretty much adhered to this roadmap. They've not ignored the sat-nav, shall we say. They've stuck pretty much to it, and over the last leadership of the Labour Party, we managed to get some decent motions through conference to start pulling away from this roadmap and start trying to undo some of the damage. Fortunately, by the time we got to the manifestos, they were in there. They were not there in their truest form. So, you know, as socialists, we need to carry on keeping the fight for a publicly owned and provided NHS. Nico, did you want to come in there?
Sure, I could throw in some things. I mean, one of them is that, I mean, it's really important to understand and talk about it and acknowledge that there's a will, there's a very, very strong political will in all the major parties to go the way they've been going. It's not, you know, like in the first few years that we were, you know, agitating, passing motions at conference and so on, there was this idea that, well, you know, if the NHS is so popular, if the party really called out what's happening and clearly reverted to the NHS's political basis, you know, of comprehensive care for everybody, what that meant, you know, stopping the A&E closures, not carrying them on, that would surely mean that there are a lot of people would vote for that, and that would perhaps attract a section of the PLP. However, I mean, we've seen, you know, innumerable examples of how the Labour right doesn't, you know, will put its agenda way before, you know, electoral considerations. You know, there's so many things that are not being done that would be popular, and you know, or the deliberate sabotage in 2017, that, you know, the stuff that's documented like that, or Blair saying that he would rather, he wouldn't want a party that campaigned on a left platform to win. I mean, his platform was actually much further left in the NHS than the platform we had from our shadow health team, because his platform was get rid of what was then the internal market, which was the beginning of this process in legal terms. And our platform in 2017, that is the one that Shadow Health brought out, actually committed to keeping profit. It said a cap on profit. That's a commitment to keeping profit. And it said, what was it? The NHS will be the preferred provider. This was copied and pasted from the Miliband years. And so if you're keeping if the NHS is the preferred provider, which has come from a US term as well, it means that, one, you're keeping a market of providers. And it's also what Boris Johnson is doing now, to tell the truth. The thing about giving out contracts to mates, that's what that is, your preferred providers. It was always preferred providers, plural. The NHS bit was just used to tell the electorate and to tell the membership, look, isn't this good? We're supporting the NHS, while in fact supporting a system where you didn't need to contract out and be subject to competition law, because not being subject to competition law is what allows accountable care organizations to grow in the US. They have an exemption, and it's the same thing that's being pursued here. And you had policymakers talking about that on Nuffield Trust, talking with somebody from Stanford University who explained that's what they're doing, and they were looking at doing that at the time of the Health and Social Care Act. So I've gone through a lot of things, but the point was there's a will to do it. And there's a $10 trillion industry, or going to $10 trillion now, that's behind it. It's bigger than banking. And it's a massive political presence in our country, you know, and the recent, you know, the recent nomination of, what's it called, designation of the UK boss of a big US corporation that does Medicare in the US, and that does the system that Medicare uses, which is accountable care organizations by any other name that's being developed in the UK by that company, by the NHS England Quango that she worked at, and that's in the coming law. That's one example of it. But I don't want to get lost, but there's a will to do it. There's a big presence of those companies in our political system, even among those who appeared supportive of the Corbyn project from think tanks, came from the healthcare industry, were interviewed on the alternative leftish media as if they were on the left. And it's not acknowledged. You have Bernie Sanders in the US talking about these companies, pointing to them, pointing to their lobbying, pointing to the politicians who work for them. And the same thing is happening here, but we need that vocabulary, we need that discourse, we need to be talking about that. We can't just be talking about the outsourcing itself when it happens, you know, or the funding, and not talking about the way the whole system is being changed by those companies with the complicity of our political class. That's my bit.
Thank you. I mean, as a person that stood on a manifesto in the last two general elections, I was on the whole proud of and happy with We've run campaigns locally to protect our NHS services in my part of South West London. But the biggest barrier we found to getting people signed up, because everybody loves the NHS, everybody values the NHS more or less. The biggest barrier we found was making people understand precisely the depths the government are sinking to take this from us. There's this idea amongst the voting public that the NHS is too big to be taken away from us. They wouldn't dare do that, would they? So it's all kind of pretty much being done by stealth. And so I think it's really important at this point to have activists and campaigners on, like both of you, to explain exactly what this all means. Nico, you mentioned the internal market. So I think it's really important we explain precisely what the internal market is. Which of you two would like to take that one?
I'll do a bit. Maybe Youssef can do another bit. I don't know.
Yeah, far away.
I'll start with my bit, because this is, I've mentioned before, but it's something I hadn't realized until I saw footage of it, that, or, you know, read it in Hansard actually, that when the British government announced the legislation that's been known as the internal market legislation, the minister who announced it acknowledged that part of it, called GP fund holding, was modeled on the health maintenance organizations from the United States. And that consisted of, part of it consisted of what we have coming into law now, which is being called integrated care, which has been called accountable care. It's all these names, but it's where you have a budget and you have people responsible for that budget, and they are given profit incentives from whatever they can cut from healthcare spending on that budget. So you get rid of a service that's considered costly from a commercial perspective, and A&Es are costly from a commercial perspective, which is why over half of the A&Es are being gotten rid of around the country. They will get a reward. That's the rough way it works. They get, there's a system of risk and what's the word again? Oh, risk and reward. That's what it's called. I mean, there's all different names for it, but they basically get a cut. So they're doing the private healthcare industry a favor by reducing the role of the NHS from this thing that covered all the healthcare needs in the country, that got in the way of private healthcare, and that showed it up. Why would you want to go private, even if you could, when everything was covered? And was covered well. They universalized the best. That's what they did. So that was always the problem, to get rid of that. So this pays people to do that, to reduce the service over time. So that was, to me, that's a discovery in recent years, that the internal market was also about introducing that, which, you know, Blair said was a terrible thing when and led up to 1997. So the manifesto was actually about getting rid of that. And then I've heard, seen the footage, and the Tories are laughing at him, and he's saying, no, this isn't bringing back GP fund holding. And they all know that it is. Because they know, as we were saying earlier on, policy wonks and so on know. And so this is the model that we're getting now. It's developed over time, and there are other aspects to it as well, but I'm fascinated by this particular aspect and the fact that it hasn't been talked about a lot. So yeah, Youssef.
Yeah, I mean, that's very, as usual, very cogent and thought-provoking from Nico, because he puts a lot of his mental energy into this. I mean, the original internal market, all I can add, was obviously a neoliberal idea. It's the idea of using competition and the market to supposedly improve costs, reduce costs, improve efficiency, by dividing the NHS up into trusts and what was described as a purchaser-provider split, in which hospitals would be providers of services and GPs would be basically the purchasers, the buyers of those services. And the idea was that if one hospital was therefore excelling, it would attract more customers, as it were, and would be more successful. So it's this market doctrine, this market logic, which the Department of Health then commissioned its own study into, and found that from the 70s up to about 2003, that as a result of the internal market, admin costs had shot up by nearly 10%. So this is one of the key cornerstone points in this debate, is that, as we've mentioned before, marketisation, privatisation increases costs. And how does it do that? Well, one of the reasons it does that is that it creates this market bureaucracy. So the irony here is we're constantly told that the public sector is inefficient, it's bureaucratic, it's a monolith. But actually in healthcare, that isn't the case at all, and I suspect it isn't the case in many public services, but healthcare is what I have done my research on in detail. In healthcare, it's actually public healthcare, which is most cost efficient. And the moment you start to introduce the market and you introduce payment tariffs, you convert hospitals into basically businesses, you start tendering contracts, auditing, you do all of these things attached to a market bureaucracy. It basically escalates the costs hugely. The other part of the equation is that you introduce corporations, the outsourcing companies, PFI companies, all these other companies who basically their only legal obligation is to obviously make as much profit as possible for their shareholders. And so that profit motive means you're introducing wealth extraction into the system. So for those two reasons, you basically inflate costs hugely. And so the more we, as Nico's already alluded to, the more we talk about funding on its own, well, that's not good enough, because actually the NHS budget is now you lose track of it, don't you? But it's 150 billion, is it now? Or something like that. It's gone up significantly. Okay. But that, a significant amount of that money is being diverted to these players, as we've seen. And the one silver lining with COVID, if in relation to this debate, is that I think outsourcing has been exposed in a way that it wasn't so apparent before. I think a much larger number of the British public are aware of the fact that test and trace was outsourced and that it's been a fiasco.
Yeah.
Although not the people that I've spoken to at the testing centres, they didn't seem to know that, but amazingly, but yeah.
Yeah, that's £37 billion. It's basically been thrown up the wall. I don't want to use Johnson's terms, but so there's billions of pounds going in to pay for middle managers and accountants when that money really should be being spent on patient care. And quite obviously, we know that if we're going to bring a company in whose first legal obligation, as you said, Youssef, is to provide profits for their shareholders, either the cost has to go up or the quality has to go down, so that they can cream off money for those streams that they need to satisfy. Yeah. Generally, it would seem that what we see is a combination of both of those worst case events happening. So the cost has gone up and the quality has gone down. There's no arguing that on the test and trace side, at least. So that is the first part. That's stage one in your important book about how to dismantle the NHS. That is well in trend. And we are seeing now this being exposed as the scam it is within the NHS, with money being wasted on apps that don't work, on contracts being given to cronies, PPE that they don't deliver, and that to companies that have no experience in the field that they're saying they'll do the job in. Yeah. So there is no scrutiny. And that's a problem as well with something that's publicly provided. If there's no accountability and scrutiny to the people that are paying for it, there's likely to be a number of problems, aren't there? And it's not just the people paying for it, it's the people working within it as well. So yourself as a GP, you have no real control over what you're able to do for your patient. And I would imagine you studied to be a doctor to help people rather than to manage budgets.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm as a salaried GP, I'm generally just involved in clinical care, but obviously there are GP partners who are running their surgeries, and there are a small segment who are then involved in obviously the reforms that came with the Conservative-led coalition government under David Cameron, who were then involved obviously in running the clinical commissioning groups. But I guess we'll come to that. But yeah, I think you're right. Obviously, for those of us who work in health and social care in the NHS in social care, it is very very disillusioning, very dispiriting to see that the quality of care is deteriorating. That we are not able to provide the care that we would like to, because we're now under such huge pressures, basically, our workload, in primary care, but the same is in hospital too, is just not sustainable. It's we're completely overstretched. And a big part of that is to do with all of what we've just been talking about. So when I was in Tower Hamlets, we had the biggest PFI, for example, at Barts Health Trust, which is the biggest trust in the country. That was 2 PFI projects, which the cost of building those 2 hospitals with PFI, if you'd funded it the good old-fashioned way, would have been about £1 billion. It's going to end up costing about £7 billion. So that's an extra £6 billion that just goes as basically revenue to those PFI companies. And that's money that could have been over, the term of the contracts, 30 years or whatever it might be, could have been spent on patient care. So that's a concrete example. And instead, for those of us in the system who are aware of this, we're just forced to be dealing with 40, 50 patient contacts a day, when the recommended amount kind of in Europe and beyond is about 25 a day. So that's just, instead of being able to employ more doctors, more nurses, the high quality health and social care is sacrificed on the altar of basically financial and economic vampires, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, that the PFI stitch up is really, really important and significant in this discussion. It's the stage 2 identified in your book. And we have seen with hospitals and with schools, PFI systems and schemes have mushroomed since the late 90s. A lot of people say, they were introduced by Blair, which is not quite right. They were obviously a John Major initiative. However, the Blairite Labour government picked that up and ran with it, and it hasn't been put down since. In fact, even now, when we know that hospitals built under PFI schemes will never belong to the trusts and the organisations that are paying the interest on it. It's, the equivalent of paying a massive interest rate for a mortgage on a property that you will never have the right to sell on. It's never actually going to belong to you, but you've got to look after it. It's a massive rip-off. And with current government, they've got a pledge of 40 new hospitals in England. It looks like they're planning on those being built on PFI schemes. I think we've got to start asking questions like, where's the money going? Who's benefiting from this? Where's the value there? So maybe you can tell us a wee bit more about PFI schemes, both of you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as you pointed out, PFI was introduced originally by John Major's government. It was, of course, then massively expanded by New Labour under Blair and Brown. And it's interesting, it did follow on from the Maastricht Treaty. I think you can draw a line of continuity from the Maastricht Treaty, which brought about the inception of the EU and the turn towards private financing, because one of the things the Maastricht Treaty did was to stipulate limits on debt and on public spending. And the moment you do that for governments, you force them to obviously turn to the private sector for financing infrastructure. So I think you can draw a line between those two events. But yeah, it was sadly massively expanded by New Labour. And in so doing, that's really tarred the Labour Party. So even when you had a progressive leader such as Jeremy Corbyn, he still couldn't escape the toxic legacy of Blair, because what you would hear from a lot of working class people was, well, what difference does it make whether it's the Conservatives who are in charge or Labour, because they both have carried out privatisation, and they would say, Labour were responsible for more privatisation than Conservatives. So that's a very difficult argument to counter. But the key point is that, of course, New Labour was a very different entity to what Jeremy Corbyn could have obviously brought. So yes, I think this goes back to a point that I think was made earlier, that you've basically, the bigger picture here is corporate capture of democracy. So you've got corporate and financial interests hijacking democracy and policy making through various strategies, such as lobbyists, such as funding, donations to parties, the revolving door, where where, top level ministers, health secretaries, Department of Health civil servants go off to work for these same interests. So all of these strategies have therefore led to it's no coincidence that you have a situation where Conservative, New Labour and Lib Dem have all carried out and implemented similar policies. But yeah, sorry, I kind of got a bit distracted, a bit of a digression there. I mean, PFI has basically left us with over £300 billion of debt as a result of these kind of rip-off mortgage schemes. That's all PFI, not just PFI in the NHS. And that's a huge amount. It's about, I think, 4 times the size of the budget deficit that was used to justify austerity. So it just goes to show how artificial and unnecessary austerity was. That actually, there's never been any serious questioning of getting rid of PFI by the political establishment. George Osborne introduced PFI2, as you pointed out. Theresa May, Boris Johnson are continuing with public-private partnerships. So what we can do and what we should do is, as a solution, is proposed by people against PFI, for example, is one group of campaigners and academics, is to basically renationalize the financial instrument, which is at the heart of these contracts, and that's the special purpose vehicle. That's what's needed in order to basically cancel that massive debt burden that is killing the NHS and other public services. And in order to, obviously, there'd have to be a matter of compensation. That's a legal issue that would have to be settled, behind closed doors or in the courts. But that's the kind of the legislative solution here for PFI.
I mean, that's really helpful. I would imagine there is actually legislation that says if a contract is patently unfair on one side, it's legally unenforceable. So perhaps there could be an argument worth exploring to see whether those PFI contracts are actually watertight legally, and if maybe there's a case to say that the organisations have been ripped off or conned, and that needs to be returned to the people that have been paying the money for it effectively, which means you and me. And what we learned in a programme, the last programme that went out, was about PFI contracts on GP surgeries or super hubs as well, which is another part of the deliberate fragmentation and marketisation of our NHS. So we're not just talking about hospitals, we're talking at every single level of healthcare provision in this country. Somebody's making money from. Nico, do you want to come in?
I'm muted. Here I am. A few things from a bit back there. It's about money, healthcare, and so-called efficiency, what it means, that kind of stuff. Because you're talking earlier, Youssef in particular was talking about the idea of efficiency and also about cost. And there's the idea put about by the sector that's pushing privatization that the money is neutral, but there's no politics involved. The idea that Thatcher was probably a pioneer in putting out, that shifting the debate. We're no longer talking about people with needs and a state providing for those needs. We're saying, but if the state is going to provide for those needs, then they have to have a strong economy first, otherwise they won't be able to do it. Therefore, let's talk about something called the economy and make it all about that. We're no longer talking about people, and we're talking about efficiency, which from a corporate perspective means getting rid of all that rubbish, like the stuff that the NHS did, which private care couldn't do because there was no profit in it, like bringing services to rural communities, to poor communities where there wasn't, because they'd only gone to where the money was. And that stuff, you don't do it. It's the same. We're talking about the post office, and I've mentioned this before. The post office in my high street where I grew up, I'm so annoyed when I see it. I go past. It's a bar, it's a trendy bar, because that's what they do. They got rid of the building, they sold it. I'm talking about actually more rural communities, which is probably not the area where I grew up, where you have small post offices that don't bring in a lot, don't have a lot of people coming in, small railway stations. You get rid of all that stuff. That's efficiency from their perspective. It's not about making sure that everybody has the healthcare they need in the simplest way possible. And so yeah, that's what GP fund holding was described. It's efficiency. We're talking about efficiency savings. What is for the chop? Things like the the local acute district general hospital that you can get to when you need to. That is not efficient, or it's not. What's the other word? One of the other words. So many words. Sustainable. If you're selling stuff on eBay and you sell cheaper than you buy, then you can't sustain that, because you're going to run out. You're not going to be able to buy anything anymore. So in business terms, that's not something you can sustain. That's what that means. It's not sustainable because it's not bringing money in. So you get rid of it, and that's efficient. So it's about the completely different goals involved. And talking about cost in the US, they've adapted that into their discourse. So the whole development of accountable care organizations, which is rehashing of the stuff that Nixon brought out, which limited state-funded care so much that it helped private sector expand to the levels it is today. It's talking about cost reduction in cost, reducing costs, because it's really expensive. And that's what you do. You stratify patients. So there was an article in the Mirror a couple of years ago, maybe or less, about a big US company that was classifying patients by how costly they are in the UK. And there's a big US company. Oh, what's all this about? And then it kind of disappears. But that's the point. That's part and parcel of the system that is replacing the National Health Service. And I think we do need to be talking about a different system based on different goals that rewards local bodies for reducing the role of state-funded, actually not necessarily state health service, making what's left profitable by efficiently getting rid of all the unsustainable bits, like the services that we need. The local GPs, where you get to see a Youssef, you're not necessarily given a cheaper member of staff. That's what it's about. And you have one locally you can get to, and especially if you're disabled or you're old or whatever, you can actually get there. All these arguments were made by people like Andrew Lansley, Jeremy Hunt, David Cameron in the 2000s when Blair was doing it. They pretended to oppose all this stuff. It's amazing. So the idea of cost has been brought into it, reducing costs, and the whole idea of austerity, which is the same stuff the IMF has been doing around the world, imposing policies. Oh, you owe us this money. Well, we can lend you a bit more, but you're going to have to, open up your economy so our companies can come in. That's what they were doing there, and that's essentially what they've been what at a national level NHS England has been doing to local bodies. And again, it's this idea of risk and reward and punishment as well. So you'll get the funding. Even Johnny Mercer, that not particularly left-wing Tory MP at the Health Select Committee, was shocked to hear. So you're not giving money to those areas that are struggling. You're giving they were giving the money to the areas that were doing all the cuts, that were doing all the things that they're being told to do as a kind of reward. So the way money is used, what it's used for, and what are the political goals, who they are meant to serve, are all, it's about, the stuff called the economics used to be, I don't pretend to know everything about that, but political economy, wasn't it? It was about politics. You've cut the politics out and you're pretending it's just about an amount, and we're all on the same side and we all have the same goals. We don't all have the same goals. So yeah, efficiency means that. It means getting rid of that. And on PFI, I'm going to stop in a second, but I did want to bring this up. I just remember this article by Alison Pollock from the 2000s. She says, in 1995, civil servants from the Department of Health, fresh from visits to the US, thought they had found the future of the NHS. They invited Kaiser Permanente, a company I'm reading, to look at whether it could deliver health services as part of the new private finance initiative in the NHS. Deliver health services as part of PFI. So the PFI is a building program of public infrastructure that brings debt, and the medical director of the company said, that the NHS was too public at the time to be able to be adapted to what they were doing. And that needs more looking into it. I don't pretend to be a specialist on it, but I'm bringing it back to that US influence and that US restructuring, which is what we're seeing today, and what it is doing, how it looks, as Bonnie said, everything, wages, patients, local services, everything is looked at in terms of what is profitable or not. That's where the discussion around cost comes in. It's actually a discussion about profit, and people involved in it may not even have the language to talk about it in that way, but that's what they're being driven towards. That's the framework in which they're being told that they need to be working, or what they need to be working towards, even if it's more colorful, prettier, geometric, nice shapes that they're painted to tell them that it's such a great thing. That's enough from me.
Yep, sorry, I should probably mute my microphone because I've got the little one just screaming. I don't know if you can hear her.
Sweet.
That's life in the Zoom age. Don't worry about it at all. No, that's really important, actually, picking up on something both of you have said. We got used to the expression in the last two general elections under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, the expression that austerity is a political choice. Well, it seems to me rather that the privatisation of our NHS is very much a political choice. It has nothing whatsoever with the goals of delivering healthcare and a fit and healthy population, which is exactly what we need the NHS to do and exactly what it was created to do. And you also mentioned earlier, Youssef, the revolving door. So the Health and Social Care Act became legislation in 2012 under the coalition government. And in actual fact, my Liberal Democrat MP was named on as an author of the Health and Social Care Act 2012. And he lost his seat in the general election that followed, probably in part because of his culpability in the destruction of the NHS, I would like to think, because we campaigned very strongly against that piece of legislation locally. But it didn't take very long for him to find employment working on health and social care matters, which then is a real problem, because you have to start looking at not only is bunging money to political parties a worthwhile investment for some of these lobbying firms, it's also a very good result for the MPs that support these pieces of legislation. So I can think of a few people that have benefited from this revolving door. Would you like to maybe highlight some of the others?
Yeah. I mean, there's countless examples of successive health ministers and secretaries under Conservative and New Labour who've then gone off to work for some of these corporate interests. And the point is that this isn't just about private healthcare or insurance companies. It's about big four accountancy firms, big three management consultants, magic circle law firms. There's a huge corporate financial lobby that's benefiting from this. Obviously, the outsourcing companies such as Serco. So it's unusual, in fact, to find a top level appointment who hasn't gone on to swish through this revolving door. For example, I think the best example is Simon Stevens, who is the current head of the NHS, if you like. Sorry, my phone keeps sliding down. He's the chief executive of NHS England, and he was an NHS manager. He then was clearly very clever and able, and became Alan Milburn and then Tony Blair's advisor in Downing Street on the NHS on health matters, and was instrumental in basically expanding that internal market that we've talked about, that limited market, expanding it through greater outsourcing, through PFI, amongst other things, through converting hospitals into what are known as foundation trusts, so kind of semi-independent businesses, bringing in a payment tariff. All of these things, he was involved. I don't know if he was involved in all of them, but he was involved in certainly a lot of those key New Labour marketisation reforms. And then he went off to work for United Health, which is now the biggest private healthcare and insurance company in the US and in the world. And he worked there as a senior executive, and I think eventually as president of global health for nearly a decade. and has then come back. Was appointed by David Cameron. So interestingly, worked for Blair, was appointed by Cameron, just goes to show that there's really less than a cigarette paper in terms of ideological differences there. And he was brought back to run the NHS, and he's been absolutely integral again in pushing this, the current, what's happening now, which is very important for us to cover, which is integrated care. And it's this US model of integrated care that is now being brought in by Boris Johnson, someone who pretended to be a champion of the people, to be a populist, and is actually now, when he was foreign secretary, spent taxpayer funds on the foreign office, helping a right-wing think tank at the time to launch, to have its launch. I think he spent something like £5,000, or allowed £5,000 to be spent on that launch. And this think tank, I think it was called the IFS or something like that. I don't know if either of you can remember the exact name. It was later forced to recant its description of itself as a think tank. It was felt that it didn't qualify as a think tank, so it was forced to get rid of that describing itself that way. But one of the things, it was one of the policies it was promoting, is that US companies should run NHS services. So that, Boris Johnson, you can see him there as foreign secretary in a very concrete example as a midwife to enabling these vehicles for corporate interests to push their ideas to Americanize, to privatize the NHS. And then as prime minister, he's obviously now very much pushing the reforms that we've seen, the white paper unveiled for integrated care this year. And we're waiting now for the full legislation. But this is a plan that's been in the works for years now.
Yeah, one of my favourite moments, speaking about Boris Johnson, one of my favourite moments in the last general election campaign was the time that Jeremy Corbyn stood up the dossier of a number of firms that were set to profit from privatisation in the NHS. And I was so thrilled to see that being made headline news, because here was concrete evidence of what we've been warning people in this call. We've been warning people of these things for well over a decade, probably longer, some people. And it's so important that we get the information out of what's happening here. This is not happening by accident. Removal of our public services is a deliberate plan. And it's not because they're being mean to take things from us. It's happening so that other people are made richer as a result of these changes. There's so much more detail that I want to be able to get into. And so far, we've covered the first 4 points of your 10 steps, Youssef. I would love to invite both of you back on to talk a bit more about what we've been discussing today. And I would ask everyone to read this book by Youssef. It is absolutely essential reading. It will really, really open your eyes up if you've somehow managed to miss all of this information that's been going on. If you're interested, I strongly recommend that book. You will be shocked. You will be genuinely shocked. And I hope both of you two will be able to come back so we can talk about the other 6 steps in the 10-step program. There is some hope as well that we can stop this. We can change things around. And the first step is to make sure as many people as possible realise robbery that's going on before our eyes. What would you say the first step we need to be campaigning for, Youssef, to stop this juggernaut? From mute.
Hiya, can you hear me? Yeah,
yep.
I think what people are very much focused on, what I've learned from campaigning and writing about this for several years, is that people are very much focused on their local services. I think it's much harder to engage with people about abstract pieces of legislation and quite complex issues to do with intra-party differences and so on. But I think what people care about is that they want to be able to get an appointment with their GP. They want to be able to have a hospital at the end of in their town, which has maternity services, has A&E, those kind of things, a good quality hospital. And so that's when people, as we've seen in various campaigns such as Lewisham and elsewhere, that's when people kind of get out on the streets, is when those things are being taken away from them. And that kind of those kind of strong campaigns are often very successful at least, halting or putting the brakes on reforms, of cuts, closures, privatization, whatever it might be. So I think that's, in terms of answering your question about I don't know if I've answered that completely, but I think you were saying what's the most important thing, that piece of information or thing that needs to be relayed. Was that? I think that was your question, was it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's just how we go about starting to put a stop to this. Yeah,
I think it's engaging with local. I think if you're watching this, or you want to get involved in this, it's finding out what's happening on your doorstep, which hospitals are facing closure and or cuts or downgrades, and very much getting involved with that, finding out perhaps which services are being outsourced, that kind of thing, because and being able to attend. Obviously now with COVID, you'd have to attend these things virtually, but attending CCG meetings or health scrutiny meetings, getting involved in patient groups, because it is only by presenting things as apolitical or depoliticized that you allow technocrats and managers to implement these things. And actually, the more of us are involved in all of this stuff, are holding them to task at a grassroots level, at a community level, the more that we can stop these things and reverse them.
So it's on us, it's on everyone watching this show. It's up to us all to get involved, and actually to think about the fact that the so-called mainstream media and most of the press will not be telling people the truth about what's going on here. So it's a case of everyone putting their deerstalker hats on, reading through the documents, which can be pretty full of technical language and ways of presenting things that make them look positive, when in actual fact, if you start sort of digging around, you find out the truth of what's going on. And questioning, asking questions. Nico, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, on developing that, losing your local A&E is not a technicality, it's not abstract, it's not technocratic, it's not complicated. It just means you don't have it and you might need it. And that is being done nationally. Normally you'd have a debate, you'd propose legislation, you'd discuss it, maybe pass it if there's a majority. The Health and Social Care Act was passed in that way, and the previous legislation as well, even though so many MPs had their own interest in private healthcare, and among other things, there were big democratic flaws, but it was passed first and then applied. And what's happening now is that's not true. It was passed as law first, and then put into action, essentially. Whereas what's about to be put into law now has been happening over the last 7 years. It's called de facto, when you without a law, and it's real. So and the point is to connect a local struggle to save an A&E from that, to connect that. Sorry, I can't speak anymore. To connect that to the national policy to close down over half of all the A&Es. To talk about that. If you don't make that connection, you end up fighting locally. And that's the reason Theresa May told Simon Stevens that she didn't want the hospital closures to be talked about at the time, that they were called sustainability and transformation plans, and Diane Abbott was opposing them, unlike the Labour right, which absolutely supports them to the hilt. Says, oh, but they need more funding. That means you support them. And so they've made big efforts, and you can see it under the Blair years, you can see it under the Tories in the last 10 years. Somebody brings up something in Parliament, and they say, no, that's a local decision, that's nothing to do with us. And they are totally national decisions. They are national plans, and that's called avoiding accountability. Without accountability, there's not a thing called democracy. It doesn't exist. So you can go and complain to your local CCG that an American company has taken over your local GP, and that will help maybe slow it down. But the process that brought it there is national, and it's coming into law, mostly after the effect. So keep bringing it back to the legislation, because that legislation is most of the stuff that's been happening over the last 7 years at least. That's my bit.
Thank you. Youssef, did you want to say something else in closing? As I say, I'll be very, very happy to have both of you back on so that we can finish discussing where we are. We're less than halfway through. It's really important book. I'm going to say it again. I'm going to give it another plug. It must be read.
Yeah, Can you hear me? I think I've unmuted myself. Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much, Bonnie. I mean, yeah, I think obviously rather than perhaps making more points, I think it would make sense to do a part 2. Absolutely, would be more than happy to do that. You know, next weekend or whenever's suitable. I mean, I think the last point Nico made, yeah, absolutely, it is about both the local and national picture. But I think that the more, obviously, that the more people do engage with it at both levels, the more pressure there is on MPs who then go back to their party leadership. I think you have to get involved, obviously, in national bodies as well. You know, we have to you know, for example, if the Labour Party is going to be in the future, I think not at present particularly, but in the future, a vehicle for reinstating and restoring a public NHS, then of course we have to change that party. We have to reform it. We have to take it back from being a from being a kind of a party that's been co-opted by corporate interest. So of course those plans for all the policies that we've talked about, the internal market, the expansion of that market, PFI, the Health and Social Care Act, integrated care, has all come obviously from top down. That's all been implemented at a government and national level. So yeah, Nico's absolutely right on that point. And yeah, I take his point that obviously if you purely engage at a local level, it's a bit of a con. You're going to struggle to actually fully reverse those plans. But I guess, yeah, you have to be involved in things at both levels. But I suppose if in every part of the country people are very much involved in their local politics, then that amounts to kind of some kind of national mobilization, I would imagine.
Totally. I think the message we can give out until people come back for the next show is to do a bit of research on their social media, find out what campaigns are underway and what threats there are to their local vision, because it's quite a good sort of gateway, if you like, into what's going on, and it makes the legislation that we're talking about, which can seem somewhat remote, far more relevant to everybody's day-to-day lives. Find out about what's going on locally, contact those groups, and start putting pressure. If you're a Labour Party member, start putting pressure through your constituency Labour Party. If you're not a Labour Party member, think about it and start getting some pressure into all of your local representatives. Stand up against these cuts and this removal of our National Health Service, our proudest achievement. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for watching. Thanks for joining in, you two. And we'll see you all again next time.